All right, folks, and welcome back to the video, pretty much continuing exactly where we left off. And I wanted to pretty much show you all how this little campaign scenario is going to end. But hopefully, so far, it's making good sense. And hopefully, y'all are getting a sense for those three main phases to really focus on: the command phase, combat phase, and movement phase. I actually mixed up the order there. It's the command phase, movement phase, followed by the combat phase. And again, you can see those details in the player turn information. Pull it up on this player card. You got your command phase, movement phase, combat phase. Right now, since we're actually finished up the Fortnite in the last video, we're actually going to switch over to the production. And so the production is only done at the beginning of the next month. And so we're actually moving on to the month of August. And so uh, with that said, I'm actually going to switch into the Soviet side just to show you all how that production can kind of look like. So let me do that real quick. And so what I've done here, now the Soviet units are visible. You can kind of get a little bit more information on how they look. And you can see all the Soviet units are going to be visible. The only German units that are still remaining visible are the ones that were in those contested areas as the attackers. So anyways, the way production works, you look at your production. The way you calculate production is pretty straightforward in the game. The way you would do it is really look at all the territory that you control and count how many production points that you have. That's basically how it works. There's a few extra caveats to that, like depending on if you control a special resource area, that may vary, but that only applies to the German side. You essentially double the value. But for everything else in the production, it's all pretty much the same. You can get all the information on exactly what you have to do for production when you actually look at this production phase. You first determine all the production points. You're going to allocate all the production points. If you're playing the full Eurofront game, you may want to transfer production points from certain fronts, one front to the other. And it's not the most efficient thing, but you can do these kind of temporary transfers to give one front some extra production points if that's your priority. You're also going to do maintenance, which is pretty straightforward, but this applies to the Mediterranean front, and you're essentially doing the maintenance with regards to the production that you have available in the actual North African front. And it's a really simple mechanic, but the developers did it well. But that applies to really the Mediterranean front. You don't have to worry about the maintenance costs or shipping costs in other parts of the game. You even have the choice of saving production points from a previous turn. And so you can actually use those. If you've saved them from previous turns, you can actually use those production points. And then, you're going to deduct everything that's leaving. And whatever you have left over, you can either spend it all or save it for the next turn. And then once you've done all that, you can actually start focusing on spending the remaining production points. And what you spend them on are either replacements or rebuilds, and maybe even deploying reinforcements. So in this particular scenario, we're not going to have any reinforcements, but we are going to have some rebuilds and some replacements. And so we can look at this production table, and we can actually look at the Soviet production. The way most people play via email in the community is that whoever finished the file, the log file, gets to do the production first. Then you send the file over to whoever you're playing against, and then they get to start the turn with their production and then proceed to move on to the next fortnight or to the next sequence in the game turn. And so right now the Soviet production is actually at 30. I can tell this because the 10 pp marker is at 3 or at 30, and then the 1 is at 0. You add them up, you're at 30. The production, of course, is normally higher in the game, but since this is a mini scenario, we're only going to worry about the 30. And we can see what the Soviets spend their money on. The first thing that they spend their money on is increasing the Soviet Stavka by 1 command point or command value. And you can look at the cost of all of these things by looking at this unit data table. And so you can look at the HQ costs. You can see that for the Soviet column, 1 step is going to cost 10 production points. And so that was That was the 10 that was spent there. That leaves the Soviets with 20 more production points. The next one that's going to be spent is on the shock unit here. That shock unit costs 3 production points per step. And this is a regular step, not the cadre cost, which is the first build, the level 1 cost. So that's going to be 3. So we're now at 13 of 30. Then the Soviets also spend another step on this armored unit. Soviet armor, you can look here, costs 4. So we've spent 17 of 30 so far. And then I think they also, the next one that they do is increase this Soviet 6th Army, which is an infantry, by another step. You look in here, the Soviet infantry is 2. So right now, altogether, they've spent basically 1 step for an armor, mech, and infantry unit. So plus an HQ. So we're at 19 production points altogether. We have 19 of 30. We have 11 production points left. This is where the Soviets start actually creating some rebuilds. So they decide to rebuild this cavalry unit. You can place a rebuild in any city. You can place it in a minor city indicated by this little ring, right? And you can place 1 rebuild there, or if it's a major city, you can place 2 reinforcements there. And of course, they can only be placed in uncontested areas. You can't rebuild units in contested hexes. They simply are too busy with a battle zone to have any new units being built there. So that's something the developers have decided. Of course, historically, you hear stories of how the Soviets were indeed building all kinds of small units and militia units and whatnot, especially for the defenses of the big cities like Stalingrad, Leningrad, and Moscow. But this game, we don't really have militia units for the Soviet army, so they're not represented in the game. But in other parts of the game, it would be an interesting mechanic to see if you could build new units in contested hexes. But for the sake of this game, for the sake of simplicity, they decided against that, and I think it was a wise choice. Anyways, this cavalry unit is a cadre. It's a level 1, therefore it is a cadre. And you can look at the cost of this cavalry unit, and you can see that its cadre cost is actually 6, so it's double the cost of its regular step. And so the Soviets had 19 of 30. Now they're going to have 25 of 30 because they've built this new cavalry. And I think they spend the last, amount of money they have on a new Soviet infantry unit, and they decide to put it at Grozny over here. And you can look at the cost of the infantry. Cadre infantry will cost 4. So altogether, the Soviets spent 29 of the 30 production points on a mixture of replacements and also rebuilds. And that pretty much sums up the production turn. If the Soviets had a reinforcement unit that may have showed up on the calendar, right? Let's see if I can find it. I don't think it's set up in this one, but you can see that there is some units that do arrive on kind of like a timeline rail, and they're just predetermined dates that these units arrive. And so those are essentially the reinforcements that come in, and they're free, and they're essentially free units that you can then grab and put on the front, and you put them during that production phase. So okay, we've done the Soviet production. Let's switch over. Basically playing the whole sequence. Let's see how it goes. So now the German production, you can see here their production was at 28. So I know that because, again, the 10 production point marker is at 20, and then this production point marker is at 8. The 1 value is at 8. You do the math, 20 plus 8, 28. So let's see what the Germans spend. And so Germans have the same amount of production, essentially the same amount as the Soviets, but their units are a lot pricier. First thing they're going to do, let's see here. Oh yeah, the first thing they're going to do is build up their HQ, just like the Soviets did. The field HQ costs the same as a Supreme HQ, so that's something to note of. You can look at the German cost. It's going to cost 10, so they've already spent 10 of 28. They have 18 left. What they essentially spend their money on is on 3 units. I'll replay the sequence again, but it's going to be this 35th Infantry Corps, the 52nd Infantry Corps, and underneath here, the 48th armored core. And the Germans essentially spend the remaining 18 production points on these three. So let's look at the cost just to show you how much it actually cost. You can see that for the infantry, it costs 4 production points per step. And then for the armor, it's double the cost. It costs 8. So you can already see that compared to these values, 4 and 8, they're definitely pricier than the Soviet costs, which are 2, 3, and 4. So that's something to be aware of. The Germans have more expensive units, but they also have more units at the start of the invasion with Barbarossa. So it's a really fascinating war, I think, the asymmetry of the conflict, and the developers have done their due diligence to sort of reflect the economics in some sense. The Soviet units are basically cheaper, almost half the cost as their German units are, but the German units are quite effective, and they have a lot of them to start with. So anyways, if you do the math, we spent the money on two infantry steps and 1 armored step. So that's going to be 4 plus 4 plus 8. Altogether, that costs 16 production points of replacements. We actually had 18, but that remaining 2 is going to have to be wasted because we can't spend it on anything else. We don't have any units that are cheap enough right now. And same thing happened to the Soviets. The Soviets had spent 29 of 30. They had 1 production point left, and they decided to forego it for the sake of building up the setup that they've decided upon. So it just goes to show that sometimes the most economically efficient option is not necessarily the most operationally efficient option, and you're constantly battling as far as decision making goes between being economically efficient versus operationally efficient, and which is a really fascinating mechanic that I've noticed in the game. Take, for example, the Germans could have not replaced, say, one of these infantry units, and they could have done a replacement of another unit way behind the front, but that means that they would have had less troops available for this operation, but perhaps more troops available for the war altogether. So you're constantly, again, making that short-term versus long-term cost analysis. And I'm sure we could really start getting into it and start quantifying those values and really getting some interesting results, which I hope to do at some point. But for now, we're just going to play the game and have me show you all how the game works. So anyways, that sums up the German production. Both sides have done their production. We're now in the August turn, the month turn. You can see again in this game sequence that you start that phase. The first phase you do for a month is the production. You can also do the diplomacy phase there afterwards, which essentially allows you to do special geopolitical events. But every fortnight is going to have the command, movement, and combat phase. But not all of them are going to have the diplomacy or production phase. These phases only occur during that first fortnight, not the second. Or actually, I think what it might be, yeah, I think that's how it goes. Pretty sure you have to do this diplomacy phase at the start of the game month. That may not be true. You actually may be able to do it on the second fortnight as well, but you can only do one diplomacy phase per month, not 2 per month. So anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go move on to the operational sequence of this August fortnight. Germans have the strategic initiative. It's the dry weather. Axis player gets to go first for dry weather against the Soviet side. And so let's see what they do. So anyways, first thing we're going to do is I'm actually going to, before I start the sequence, let me actually switch back to the third-party perspective, so we can actually see how the game looks normally. And now all the units are hidden except for those that are in the contested hexes. The way this sequence is going to start is this time the German player is going to activate their OKH. And OKH is a Supreme HQ, just like the Soviet Stavka was. So again, a limited range for these Supreme HQs, but only 2 Supreme moves per command value. So 3 command values, therefore 6 Supreme moves on this turn. Some of them can be via rail in friendly territory, or we can do operational moves, and we'll see what the German player does now. So the German player deployed this HQ. I'm actually going to return it to Warshilovgrad, but I wanted to show that if you wanted to, in theory, you can you can deploy the HQ, and essentially the deployment is just a little initial bump. You can move this HQ a little bit more forward to a more favorable position. It's not a huge change, but it is subtle enough to give your HQs slightly extra way of advancing or withdrawing from certain regions. And so, I guess this OKH did indeed deploy forward, but I could have left it in Voroshilovgrad just as much, and it would have still been able to activate. So activate, deploy are two different things. First supreme move is going to be to basically move this German unit, it looks like, from Rostov E1 to the south to basically Kropotkin, if I'm pronouncing that right. And you can see this unit basically marched to the south. So that's one supreme move. And in fact, it's actually doing 3 moves. So this has to be a a German armored unit if it's moving 3. But that's exactly what it's doing. So the first German move is a very aggressive move. It's actually moving all the way from Rostov E1 all the way down to my Kop, it looks like. And it's doing a river assault. So that's one move. Next move looks like the second German unit that was there is now moving to Krasnodar, securing the left flank of this attacking German unit. So that's 2 supreme moves. The third supreme move, German unit looks like it marches east of Kamensko all the way down to east of Salsk. And now, so that's already 3 supreme moves. We have 3 more left. The next one is that the German army is actually going to start withdrawing units from Rostov. So that's what we're seeing here. This German unit is hidden, and it's actually going to withdraw from Rostov. Again, there is a hexside limit here of 1 because of the river crossing. You can always check those hexside limits again, going back to those terrain effect table, and you can see that for river, doesn't affect stacking, but it will affect the hexside limit. Again, that only applies to battle hexsides. It does not apply to unoccupied hexsides. It only applies to those when you're moving units either in or out of a battle. So this unit is moving out of Rostov, and it's actually going to, looks like it's moving all the way down to Kropotkin. And it looks like, I don't know if it's moving across. No, it's going to stay there. And this unit, because it was previously in a contested hex, it actually is unable to re-enter a combat hex on this turn. It would have to wait until the next movement sequence to re-enter. No unit can exit and re-enter on the same movement turn. That's something to think of. German unit decides to withdraw yet another unit from Rostov. This time this unit has to move out from a northern hex side, northeastern hex side, because the eastern hex side has already been used up on this turn. So this unit's going to move slightly north and then circle around, and it looks like it's making its way to fill in the gap basically between Salsk and Kotelnikovo. And then I think this is our last supreme move. Unit from Kamensko is now moving all the way to Salsk. And so in essence, the Germans have moved their units into Soviet territory. That's essentially what's happening. A lot of movement is going on right now. Quite an impressive movement sequence. Altogether, the Germans have moved 6 units, and you can see how much the front is changing from where it was previously. Germans are now deeper in Soviet territory, and they're kind of expanding. They've achieved a breakthrough, basically, and they're now exploiting that breakthrough. The last thing to do is a battle sequence, and the Germans are going to attack right here in my Kop. It's mandatory because it's a newly contested hex. And we're also applying this airstrike. You might be wondering where this airstrike is coming from. It's actually coming from OKH. The Supreme HQs have double the command range as the regular HQs. So this HQ can actually have a command range of 6 because its typical command range would have been 3, but since it's doubled, it's actually 6. So let's see, from Voroshilovgrad, which is where it's at right now, if we were to add up the hexes, 1, 2, 3, 4, my Kop is 4 hexes away, and so it's within range of that HQ. Now, even if this OKH was at level 2 and I had activated it, I still would have been able to provide air support to my Kop. The only difference would have been that it would have been a level 2 airstrike, not a level 3, since the command value here is level 2. So it's always just good to know that the Supreme moves, the easiest way to think about the Supreme HQs is that a lot of their abilities are doubled, essentially. So anyways, I just wanted to show a little bit of contrast there. But in this scenario, this HQ is at full strength, and the airstrike is also going to be at full strength. Now, something else to note about Supreme HQs is that they have a limited range, but they do not have the ability to provide combat support. Combat support is basically the effect that if an HQ is within range of a battle, that the battle receives some kind of support from the HQ. If you have unsupported combat, the consequences are that the defender are going to gain that double defense automatically. That's basically what happens. So your offensive capability is reduced when you have unsupported combat. Still doesn't mean that you can't do combat, but it means that your combat is limited. So anyways, let's move on to this unsupported battle here in my co-op and see how it plays out. So the units are revealed. We're going to start with the airstrike. The airstrike scores 2 hits, again with that double fire, but because it's double defense, due to the unsupported effect, the defenders only receive 1 hit, not 2. Now we have to remember this is a minor city, not a major city, so there is no defensive advantage. Had this area had double defense, in addition to the unsupported combat, it would have been triple defense. So the defending advantages compound on top of one another depending on the overall situation. So anyways, the airstrike scores 2 hits, unsupported, therefore 1 hit altogether because of the double defense effect. Now the defenders get to roll. They would have scored 2 hits had it been a mech unit or an armored unit or a shock unit, but it's infantry. They only score on single fire. They score no repulses. The roll was a 3, and we can look at the repulse table. Here on the left, you can see that the value had been a 1 or a 2 for it to be a repulse, unless it was mud turn. And if it were a mud turn, I mean, frankly, none of these breakthroughs would have been happening because the movement speed for units in mud is almost all of them is reduced down to 1, except for cavalry, which is 2. So yeah, mud turns are much harder to do any kind of breakthrough. I don't think you can't even blitz during mud. So mud is terrible for everybody. We're dealing with dry weather, so we don't have to worry about that. No repulse happened, but the defenders did score 1 hit. So the Panzer Corps will take a hit there. Finally, the Panzer Corps gets the roll. They score no hits. And so that pretty much wraps up the round of combat there. And that pretty much, I think, is going to sum up. We have one more battle here. The Germans do decide to attack Kotelnikovo, also going to be unsupported. Let's see how this battle plays out. Soviets reveal their units. And let's see what the defenders always get to roll first. We'll start with the mech unit, the strongest. They score 2 hits. Ouch. And the infantry score no hits, no 6 there, only a 3. And now the German armored unit here takes those 2 hits. The attackers do not have double defense naturally since they're the attackers. So these two hits there, not a good look for the Germans. They only have 2 divisions basically protecting the flank, something to take note of there. And then finally they get to roll 2 and they score no hits. So Germans kind of wasted the attack there essentially. And then finally, so we've done the 3 phases. We did the command phase, movement phase, and combat phases. Now let's do the supply phase. Again, when you're playing, depending on who's the active player on the turn, since this is the Axis turn, they're the active player. When you check supplies, you always check the supplies of the passive player's units. And so the only unit that we have to check about supplies is this unit in Rostov. That's the only one that's actually going to be out of supplies. Now, to be clear about how supplies works, if I haven't explained it enough already, you basically want to check to see where your railheads are. And railheads pretty much represent the last territory in which you have rail lines that are moving through freely and undisturbed by enemy activity. Rail lines always end in a friendly controlled hex. Doesn't matter who controls it. as long as all the rail lines that extend from that hex are moving through unoccupied or uncontested friendly territory. So we definitely have a rail line in Stalingrad for the Soviet side. Since we're doing the passive player supply check, we're checking the supplies of Soviet units on the German turn. I know that might be a little confusing, but hopefully just saying it aloud makes sense. You can also go down here on the supply status, and you basically, I was hoping it would have showed like passive, but you always are checking the supply status of enemy units pretty much. You may be checking the supply status of some friendly paradrops perhaps, but almost all of them involve supply status of enemy units. You may even use, you may also activate beachheads there for your friendly units. Anyways, we have a Soviet rail line in Stalingrad. That's the main point. We do not have a friendly Soviet rail line in Koltonikovo because the rail line would have extended through Stalingrad, and Stalingrad is contested. So no rail line can leave Stalingrad and extend any further than that. So you might be thinking these units are out of supplies, but you are wrong because you need to be 2 hexes away from a rail line to be in supplies, right? So supply lines are not necessarily rail lines. Supply lines require 2 friendly hexes. And you can think of supply lines as basically supplies that are done via road and rail. They don't require rail lines. They can be done via truck. So all the Soviet units that are around this railhead here are in supplies. And of course, you know, technically there's, I mean, all these other friendly controlled Soviet hexes can act as supply sources, right? So this area east of Stalingrad can also act as a supply line for the units right here in Kotelnikovo. But for the sake of the game, the easiest thing to think about is always put the rail line in the most advanced position along the front. Likewise, we can do that in the south. We're going to have a rail line in Maikop. Its rail line is extending and basically going into further south through this rail line that goes towards Tbilisi and Batumi. But we have another rail line here in this town of Armavir, and its railhead is actually going east, and it's using this rail line that goes to Grozny, basically, in this other area, which, if I dare to pronounce, is Orzonikidze, which hopefully I pronounced okay. Anyways, 2 different rail lines having 2 different sources of supplies, but both are effective. Now, if this German unit, say, was in Stavropol, its zone of control would have been here and here, and actually it would have cut off the rail line, and this unit would have not had a railhead. So I just wanted to show that as well. And what's the point here? The point is that all these Soviet units are in supplies. The only unit that isn't in supplies is this unit in Rostov. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, can't this unit actually be in supplies via sea? And the answer would actually be correct. This unit would be in supplies via sea, since the Soviets still control the port, and they still control this body of water, since this little black icon represents a naval base. So by default, Soviets are going to control this entire body of water, the Sea of Azov. So you might be thinking, well, what's the problem? What's the dealio? Why can't the Soviet Union and Rostov be in supplies? And the reason why is because if you know anything about 1942 and about the month of August in this sector, you know that by this stage in the war, the Germans have already taken Sevastopol. So the easiest way to think about it is that Sevastopol is under German control. The entire Crimean Peninsula, in fact, is under German control. So what does that mean? It means that the western banks of this strait that goes from Kerch to Novorossiysk, is actually one of the sides is being controlled by the enemy, and because of that, no supplies can go through this territory. That basically is what it means. And so, unfortunately, the supply path here is cut by the fact that half of the strait is being controlled by the enemy. Now, there's a few other caveats to, the effects of straits, I think you can have national supplies that can go through these. National supplies being a little different than regular supplies. It basically has to deal with a nation having its sovereignty. But for the sake of basic supplies, operational supplies, the Union of Rostov has no supply path. None via the ground. Unfortunately, no railheads in range at Rostov, and at the same time, no sea lanes available either. So because of that, the Soviet Union is going to basically be reduced in strength automatically. We can actually switch to the Soviet side to see how that happens. Because the Soviet Union is actually at level 1 cadre, when we do the supply check, it's going to disappear. Since it was already at cadre, it's going to be eliminated automatically. So that's basically how the supply system works. At the end of every supply phase, units that can't achieve supplies are eliminated or reduced by 1 command value. And so that unit was already at its cadre strength, its breaking strength, so it officially surrenders. The Germans control Rostov, and now all these German units that previously were out of supplies are going to be in supplies on this turn. So that's going to be a nice thing for the Germans. And so now I can switch back to that third-party perspective. Few things to change. You want to change the production icons now that Rostov has changed hands. So you want to change those production tables. I guess before I do that, I deactivated OKH, indicating that the HQ is done. It's been deactivated. I also get to hide the German units in Rostov now that they are in a friendly controlled hex. And then I also proceed to reduce the Soviet production to 29 production points, and I increase the German production to 29 production points from 28 production points. So altogether, you basically have a case of the Germans broke through. They are putting pressure on the Soviets. They were able to encircle and cut off Rostov, and they even took the city itself without even having to fight that last bit by cutting off those supplies. And so that's going to pretty much sum up the German turn. It's going to sum up the German fortnight. We get to switch over to the Soviet side, and I believe the Soviet player on this fortnight is going to pass the turn and actually do nothing. So that's an option that you have as a player. You don't actually have to make a move every time in every game. You don't have to activate an HQ every time. You can actually do nothing on that turn, and you can save your attacks for a later moment, save up on production, or focus on another part of the war and focus on operations elsewhere. So that's something to take note of. And yeah, the Soviets passed their turn, and we're going to move on to the next fortnight. And I think we have one last fortnight to show in this particular scenario. And then with that, we're going to wrap it up here. So I'm going to stop here and stay tuned for part 3, where we can essentially wrap up the final sequence in this really great little tutorial that the developers have made for their game.